I want to begin with something so ordinary, it almost doesn't seem worth mentioning. Not a war, not a buried city, not a vanished civilization, just a name. Or more precisely, the sudden, government-ordered, coordinated removal of thousands of them. Because here is what kept pulling me back the deeper I went into this. To erase a civilization from memory, you don't need to demolish its buildings. You don't need to burn its archives, though we'll get to that part too. All you really need to do is change what its places are called. And if you do that quickly enough, completely enough, simultaneously enough, then within 1 or 2 generations, no one remembers what stood there before. That is exactly what happened. Not slowly, not organically, not the gentle linguistic drift that turned New Amsterdam into New York across the span of centuries. I am talking about single days, single decrees, hundreds of cities across continents, stripped of their names in coordinated waves inside a narrow window of history. In 1794, in France, Lyon, Bordeaux, Marseille, 3 of the largest, most historically significant cities on the European continent. All 3 lost their names on government order, almost simultaneously. In 1894, in America, a federal directive, Order 114, issued by the United States Board on Geographic Names. Hundreds of place names stripped of certain words. Words like old, words like new, words like ridge and valley. Removed overnight in a single administrative motion, and Illinois, one state, just one, accounts for 157 of the 323 recorded American renames from that period. 157. The official explanation is postal efficiency, revolutionary politics, bureaucratic modernization. And maybe that really is all there is to it. But the coordination, the timing, the pattern. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let me take you to France first. The year is 1793. A revolution is devouring everything in its path. Not only kings and aristocrats, but names themselves, streets renamed, saints scrubbed out. The calendar abolished and rebuilt from a new year zero. This is the explanation we're handed. The Jacobins were erasing the old order and rebuilding France clean, rational, modern, fine. I accept that as a partial answer. But here is where the official story starts to strain. On October 12, 1793, with enforcement rolling through 1794, the Committee of Public Safety issued decrees renaming cities accused of what they called Federalist crimes. Lyon had resisted Paris. Toulon had welcomed in the British. Marseille had rebelled. So Lyon became Commune affranchie, the liberated commune. Marseille became Ville sans nom, literally, city without a name. Not metaphorically, officially. A city of hundreds of thousands of people, one of the oldest continuously inhabited urban centers in the Western world, deliberately rendered nameless. Sit with that for a moment. The revolutionary explanation is punishment, political humiliation. And yes, the politics were real. The grievances are documented. I'm not waving them away. But the further I dug, the stranger it got. Because the renaming didn't stop at the rebellious cities. It spread. It became systematic. It reached cities that had never rebelled. Small towns, villages, places with no Federalist crime attached to them at all. Renamed, reformed, reclassified. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Then I started cross-referencing the dates. Not the broad revolutionary period, the specific decree dates. And what emerged was not the messy, organic rollout of political punishment unfolding across months. What emerged were clusters, single days on which multiple cities, in different regions, with different political histories, were administratively renamed at the same time. Which raises a simple but uncomfortable question. What logistical mechanism existed in 1793, without telegraphs, without railways, without anything resembling modern communication infrastructure, capable of coordinating mass renaming events across an entire country in apparent synchrony? The silence on that question in the standard histories is deafening. Now cross the Atlantic, jump forward a century. It is 1890. America is in the middle of its great administrative consolidation. The postal network is expanding. The railroad system is complete. The frontier, famously, has just been declared closed. And in 1894, the United States Board on Geographic Names issues Order 114. I want you to really sit with what this order does. It doesn't rename cities for political reasons. It doesn't punish rebellion. It doesn't commemorate revolution. It does something almost more striking in its banality. It strips descriptive words out of place names. Old, removed. New, removed. Ridge, removed. Valley, removed. Hundreds of American towns, overnight, no longer called what their own founders had called them. The official explanation here is efficiency, postal routes, duplication. The growing federal mail system could not cope with 12 different towns called New Valley in 12 different states, so standardization became necessary. That is a reasonable explanation. It would be entirely satisfying, if not for one thing. Illinois. 157 renames, in one state, under one order. I have spent time with this number. I have tried to make it make sense purely in logistical terms. Because even if you grant the postal argument in full, even if you say, yes, duplication was a real problem, why does Illinois account for nearly half of all recorded renames under Order 114? Was Illinois' postal infrastructure uniquely chaotic? Were Illinoisans uniquely attached to the words old and ridge? Did something about the Illinois landscape produce a peculiar fondness for valley in place names that the other 40-some states somehow avoided? Or is there another pattern underneath this one? A geographic pattern, a historical pattern, one the postal efficiency frame simply cannot reach. The deeper I went, the more Illinois stopped looking like an administrative outlier and started looking like a focal point. And here is where it becomes impossible to ignore. Illinois, the Illinois River Valley, the upper Mississippi corridor, is precisely the region where 19th century researchers, engineers, and settlers kept stumbling across things they could not explain. Earthworks of impossible scale, canal systems of unexpected sophistication, road alignments that matched no known indigenous engineering tradition and matched no documented European colonial project either. Places with old names, names that pointed backwards, toward something prior, and in 1894, those names were gone. I want to linger on one city in particular because this city named itself, and in doing so, may have told us exactly what we are not supposed to know. Phoenix, Arizona. The name was chosen in 1867 by Darrell Duppa, a British settler with a classical education, and the name he chose, Phoenix, was not arbitrary. Duppa looked at the landscape around him, at the ruins beneath his feet, and he said, explicitly, that this place should be named for the mythological bird that rises from the ashes. Because, in his own words, this was a civilization rising from the ruins of a prior one. That is not a fringe interpretation. That is not alternative history. That is the documented, first-person, contemporary explanation given by the man who named the city. He saw ruins. He named the city after rebirth from ruins. Now, the ruins in question, and the infrastructure in question, were the canals. When Anglo-American settlers arrived in the Salt River Valley in the 1860s and 1870s, they found a canal system already in place. Not sketched in, not half-built, in place. Hundreds of miles of engineered waterways aligned to the landscape, capable of large-scale agricultural irrigation, moving water with a sophistication modern engineers have described, without irony, as remarkable. The settlers did not build these canals. They used them. They cleared them out, reinforced them, and started running water through a system someone else had engineered. Who? The academic answer is the Hohokam, a pre-Columbian civilization that disappeared, somewhat mysteriously, around the 15th century. That is the name attached to the builders. The Hohokam, gone before European contact, leaving behind a canal network that a 19th century city would simply inherit. And here is where I want to ask a very careful, very simple question. Not who built the canals. That question has an official answer, even if the answer raises its own mysteries. Not when the Hohokam disappeared. That question has a range of dates, a set of theories, a bibliography. No. The question I want to ask is this. How do you build hundreds of miles of precisely aligned, functionally integrated irrigation canals in a desert, at a scale a 19th century American city would happily use for decades, without leaving behind any of the industrial, social, or population infrastructure that should accompany a civilization capable of that engineering? And then I want to ask the quieter question underneath that one. If a prior civilization built something so sophisticated that the next civilization to arrive simply started using it, didn't need to understand it, didn't need to reverse engineer it, just turned on the water, what does that suggest about the sophistication of what came before? And why does the name of the city built on top of it explicitly reference the civilization it replaced? Phoenix. Rising from the ashes, the settlers named it that themselves. Now I need to talk about something that appears on maps, and then, with remarkable speed, stops appearing on maps. Tartaria. If you go back to European cartography of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, you find something contemporary. World maps simply do not show. A vast territorial designation, sometimes called Grand Tartary, sometimes Tartaria Magna, covering an enormous expanse of northern and central Asia. Russian Tartary, Chinese Tartary, independent Tartary. Subdesignations and internal regions, on maps produced by the most respected cartographers of the era. This is not a fringe notation. It appears on maps from Bleu, from Ortelius, from Mercator, from the French Royal Cartographic tradition, from British Admiralty surveys. These are not obscure sources. These are foundational documents of Western geographic knowledge. And then, across the late 18th and early 19th centuries, roughly the same window we have been examining, the same window of revolutionary upheaval, administrative reorganization, and mass renaming. Tartaria begins to shrink on the maps, then contract, then fragment, then disappear. By the mid-19th century, it is gone. The designation has been absorbed into Russia, into China, into Central Asian administrative units under new names. The official explanation is that Tartaria was never a political entity, just a geographic placeholder, a European catch-all for territories that weren't well understood. As European knowledge improved, The term was retired in favor of more precise designations. That is a coherent explanation. But here is what that explanation struggles to account for: the speed of the disappearance and the coordination of it. Because this isn't one country revising its maps. This is a pan-European, multi-imperial, multi-cartographic tradition, all converging across roughly the same decades on the same decision. Tartaria is no longer a useful category. Tartaria goes away. At the same time, cities in France are being renamed. At the same time, American place names containing words like old are being stripped. At the same time, Phoenix is being built on top of canals no one can fully explain. The evidence suggests something much larger than any single one of these events implies on its own. Because patterns at this scale, geographic, administrative, cartographic, simultaneous, cross-continental, don't emerge from coincidence. They emerge from processes, and the process, whatever it was, appears to have concluded by the end of the 19th century, with the world looking substantially different from how it looked at the start of the 18th. Different names, different maps, different stories about what came before. I keep returning to what I call the coordination problem, and this, for me, is the heart of it. Not the specific renames, not any individual map, not Phoenix's canals or Lyon's missing name. The coordination. In 1793, the French government renamed multiple major cities simultaneously. But the French government in 1793 was a committee of men meeting in Paris, in the middle of a civil war, in a country without railways, sending dispatches by horse. The logistical capacity to simultaneously rename cities across a country of that scale and enforce those renames within a matter of days is at minimum worth pausing on. In 1894, the American Board on Geographic Names issued an order removing specific categories of words from hundreds of place names in a single action. The board had been established in 1890. It had been operating for 4 years, and in one move, it processed and enacted more renames than any comparable action before or since. Not a decade of gradual reform, not a rolling program of postal reclassification. One order, hundreds of names gone, and 157 of them in Illinois. The official explanation, efficiency, modernization, standardization, doesn't collapse here, but it bends. It strains. Because efficient systems do not usually produce anomalies of that scale without explanation. They produce smooth, predictable, geographically distributed outcomes. They do not produce single states accounting for nearly half the total, unless the distribution was never random to begin with. Unless Illinois specifically was where the concentration of prior naming, the naming that needed to be erased, was greatest. And here's the strangest part. When I started looking at what those 157 Illinois names actually were, not just the words that got removed, but the original full names, a pattern emerged that I am not prepared to characterize definitively, but I am prepared to ask about. Many of them pointed backward. Names containing old tend to acknowledge that something came before. Names containing valley and ridge tend to be topographic, tied to the landscape itself, to the physical memory of a place. When you remove those words, you sever the linguistic connection between a location and its own history. Old Shawneetown becomes Shawneetown. The old is gone. The question of what old was referring to, what the older Shawneetown looked like, who built it, what was there before, stops being part of the name, stops being part of the daily vocabulary of everyone who lives there. A generation later, nobody asks. Why would they? It's just Shawneetown. That is how you erase something without burning it. There is one more layer to this, And I want to handle it carefully. Because the renaming is one thing. The cartographic erasure is another. But there is a third anomaly I have been circling this whole time, and I think it deserves to be named directly. Buildings. Across the middle and late 19th century, in cities throughout Europe, Russia, and America, there is an explosion of architectural construction historians describe as a golden age of civic building. Neoclassical government palaces, grand train stations, exhibition halls, World's Fair pavilions, ornate municipal structures in cities that, by their own records, had been rough frontier settlements only decades earlier. The standard history says industrial wealth, architectural ambition, skilled immigrant labor, and all of that is real. But here is the question the architecture itself keeps quietly asking. Where are the intermediate stages? When you look at a city that goes from frontier settlement to possessing world-class neoclassical architecture inside the span of 20 or 30 years, without proportionate documentation of construction timelines, of labor forces, of material sourcing, of the architectural education infrastructure that would have been required, the official explanation starts to demand a great deal of faith. Not impossible faith, not supernatural faith, but faith nonetheless. And when you layer that architectural anomaly over the renaming pattern, cities renamed just as they are being rebuilt, just as new civic identities are being installed, just as the cartographic record is being tidied up, a question emerges I find I cannot stop asking. What were these buildings before they became what we now call them? I am not claiming an answer. I want to be very clear about that. I am asking a question the evidence, to me, makes unavoidable. If cities can be renamed in a day, if cartographic traditions can be retired in a generation, and if canal systems can be inherited without documentation of their builders, then what else may have been inherited? What else may have been renamed, restored, and reattributed, while the prior attribution was quietly, efficiently, officially retired? I began this investigation looking for something small, an anomaly, a footnote, a piece of data that didn't fit cleanly into the official timeline. What I found instead was a window that opens onto roughly 100 years of history, roughly 1750 to 1900, during which the names of the physical world were substantially reorganized, during which the maps of the physical world were substantially redrawn, during which cities in France, Russia, and America lost their names in single days, during which a federal order stripped hundreds of American towns of their oldest, most backward-looking descriptors overnight, during which a vast territorial designation called Tartaria contracted and vanished from the cartographic record, during which a city in the Arizona desert was named, by its own founders, after rebirth from the ruins of something prior, and built on canals nobody could fully explain. I am not telling you what this means. I genuinely don't know what this means. But I am asking you, as someone who has spent a long time in these archives, cross-referencing these dates, staring at these maps, to consider the possibility that the official explanations we have been given are not wrong exactly. They may be accurate as far as they go. The question is whether they go far enough. Because the coordination problem doesn't go away. The Illinois number doesn't go away. The cartographic timing doesn't go away. Phoenix's own founders don't go away. The canal system beneath the desert doesn't go away. And somewhere inside all of that, there is a question that isn't being asked loudly enough. Not whether the past was erased. The evidence suggests something much larger than a simple no can account for. Not when it happened. We have the dates, and they are shockingly specific. Not where. We have France and America and Russia and the maps of Central Asia. The geography is world-spanning. No. The question, the one that keeps me up at night, the one that brought you here, is why. Why does the coordination exist? Why does the timing cluster? Why does Illinois account for 157 of 323? Why does a desert city name itself for a phoenix rising from ruins, built on canals it didn't dig, reaching for a civilization it may not fully understand itself to be inheriting? Why do places stop being called what they were, all at once, on the same days, in different countries, as if something large, something prior, something that had names and maps and canals and architecture, was being administratively concluded, filed away, renamed, and buried just shallow enough that, a century later, someone sitting in an archive with old maps and a list of city decrees might look up from the papers and think, wait, this isn't random. This isn't coincidence. This is a pattern. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it.